Welcome back to Cyber Talk with Nikolai, Part 3, Unpacking National Cybersecurity Strategy with Jim Ross. Thank you, Jim, for that. And definitely, I'm with you on DMARC, considering that phishing right now is number one vector that organizations getting owned and ransomware or anything else happens to them. So it's enforcing something through the executive order would have been helpful. And passwordless, yes, that's my favorite subject as well. So I think we had passwords. We've been using passwords long enough, and it's time to sort of get off passwords and get into passwordless world. So one question actually I have on shaping market forces. So it seems like what you mentioned on SBOM, and there is also provision in this executive order for shifting liabilities for software products and services to promote secure development process.
Hmm.
So in one way, it's I'm not clear what they're actually trying to establish. So I understand the intent. So they go and to make sure that organizations can produce the software that is of good quality, but then we all know it's not an easy task to make it happen. It's not constructing the house, and even builders in the house, they give warranty for defects for 5 years or 10 years, and then pretty much you're on your own. If house falls apart in 11th year, you're going to be rebuilding on your own. So in software, where it changes so quickly, and whatever is big today, and considering how many different things, and I think you alluded to it on SBOM, comprised of. So you bring in libraries and different components from tons of different places and open source and this and that. And then how can some organization to say, well, how would we guarantee that this software is going to do just that and it's not going to happen? So I was not really clear, and the EO was not really clear in a sense to explaining it's like, well, what do you expect from organizations to do? They cannot just list every single thing and say they're 100% gonna work as expected, but you have interoperability and interconnectivity between different components that will create a problem regardless.
Yeah. So I'm going to share with you a story. I recently upgraded. I live in Florida in a condo, and I recently upgraded hurricane shutter. And in the installation, they had to take the old one out, the old hurricane shutter out, install the new one. And before it could be operational, there were three different inspectors that had to inspect different aspects. There was an electrical inspector. There was a county inspector for, hurricane viability, I guess, and then there was another inspector. And all three inspectors were individual inspectors. And when we ordered this service and we're talking about it, they said, yeah, it has to be inspected by these. And I said, well, how's that going to happen? Oh, don't worry, they coordinated. It works out fine. They basically said, don't worry about it. And sure enough, they installed the unit. It worked. They demonstrated, but it wasn't finally approved until all three inspectors. Well, literally, all three inspectors came within about 45 minutes of each other in a particular allotted time. Did their inspections, very kind, courteous, in provided information. Took 5 minutes per inspection, and and it was done. And I marveled at the thought that at a practical level, post we had hurricane damage, so we could actually coordinate all of the government inspections that were required. And of course, the inspectors, they provide a valuable service. So it's, in this case, from a consumer standpoint, it's positive, even though it's a hurdle you have to go over. My point is, they made it work. They made it practical. They made it feasible. So if we apply that to the SBOM, perhaps, I think there's this um, unpredictable or uncertain, unmeasured today, but this expectation that software providers are sharing their intellectual capital with an SBOM. And what's happening in the evolution of technology is we now have choices of there's at least 4 or 5 products in the market today that allow an enterprise to generate an SBOM on any software, including third-party software, without access to the source code. And of course, the source code is where the intellectual capital is, anyway. So to be able to suggest that the SBOM itself is a version of intellectual capital that shouldn't be shared is it's kind of by the boards. In other words, we've outlived that kind of thinking. With Log4j as an example of a software supply chain poisoning attack, every single enterprise had to manually go through and see how pervasive the use of that open source capability was to their environment and remediate. And like any vulnerability remediation at any level, if you know what your inventory is to begin with as a baseline, the amount of labor and that's necessary for remediation it shrinks. But if you have to figure out what your inventory is across an enterprise, it's very expensive. It's very expensive. So having SBOM capability as an example is actually relatively straightforward because it's essentially an inventory of the components, open source components, that allow an enterprise to decide or determine how quickly and how appropriately to address remediation when it's necessary, which is becoming more common. So there's part of me that says, there's got to be a way for us to work, the collective industry and federal sectors, and even state and local government sectors. There's got to be a way for us to work through this challenge of software resilience, putting accountability, really back to the providers of the software. And I say putting it back because the end user license agreement, which was paramount to creating a thriving and world-leading production capability for intellectual capital in the software business, which we're all benefiting from in some way, shape, form, or fashion. But it's time to kind of drive accountability for resilience in software back to the creators of the software, and that's really where it ultimately belongs. And as consumers of enterprise software, we should have an expectation that our enterprise software providers are telling us what the inventory is in a using an SBOM capability, and if they don't, well, then we'll choose a technology to derive that ourselves and make the right decisions when there's a supply chain issue. Now, that's a very simplistic approach, and it's certainly a far cry for what's in practice today. But it is something, from my standpoint, that I think we need to push for, and I think the strategy identifies that.
I agree with that, and definitely something can be done to a certain extent. And I guess the question would come is like, who's going to read SBOM, right? Like in an example of your inspectors, they came in, they knew what they were doing, and they pretty much nicely and courteously explained to you what their purpose and what the goal and what they were looking for, and they gave their check mark, and you were happy with the services were performed as expected. So in SBOM, it's sort of responsibility that organization is going to read it, or there will be some third party that is going to validate SBOM and say, yes, this organization or this company is doing well, because you know how it works. Right now, it's difficult even to perform risk assessments and all these questionnaires that you're trying to deal with organizations to understand where they stand. Now you got this SBOM coming in, and somebody has to understand, okay, what am I looking here? Is it good? Is it bad? Or do I care at all?
That's true. Although I would, my own perspective is the enterprise will get a lot more out of an SBOM than it will any answers to questions from a questionnaire related to software resiliency. So whatever questions are being asked today from a third-party governance standpoint at the enterprise level, the response doesn't give you a whole lot of things to work with in terms of understanding risk for that particular product, whereas an SBOM will. at minimum, it will tell you what the risk is to in terms of the dependency on open source components that could be compromised in the future. And it's it's there's no opinion or self-attestation that's required as part of that process. It's an artifact, and it's a far better artifact to use for risk assessment and risk management than any questionnaire that's used today.
Got it. No, makes sense. All right, let's switch gears a little bit into resilient future. So part of the law or part of the executive order that the investments will be made in a resilient future, and I think it's a good thing. From my point of view, it's how would you see GM affecting organizations, and who would be major benefactors from all those changes? Like once the government starts investing, there certainly will be some organizations that will benefit from it, and how that will affect the industry, or how would it affect cybersecurity when all those investments are being made.
Yeah, I think the first level investments that's referenced, I don't think an amount was provided, but it's we've seen from some of the bills that have been put forward in Congress that there's an appetite to spend on semiconductor manufacturing production onshore to address some of the scarcity of resource and political consequences of that we face in the semiconductor manufacturing and production and really design manufacturing and production capability, as well as the tools to support that. The more narrow the supply chain in any of those elements, the more difficult it is for economic growth for any country. And so spreading the capabilities across borders is maybe the next evolution of globalization. That whereas instead of concentrating the risk in a few small providers that could be exposed to political turmoil, we're spreading the risk somewhat. In this case, the biggest obstacle is that the level of capital investment is so high. It's really only the federal government that's in a position to actually influence that, so that private enterprise will step up to the plate because the government's created an environment that enables them to do that with some matching funds. And so that will have a big impact politically and a big impact economically, at least in terms of chip manufacture. If we then, pivot and think about internet infrastructure and a major investment in internet infrastructure to make it more ubiquitous and easy for all citizens to be able to access technology, that has material benefit for a whole number of reasons in terms of access. But in addition to that, it also means that with that kind of spend, that kind of investment, that will continue to play the U.S. specifically, the intellectual capital created in the private sector will be used as an opportunity for development for new capability that's spread across the entire infrastructure and those users of the infrastructure, and therefore we get to dictate or determine standards. And those standards then can be written in the interest of the consumer. And so that shifts some of the burden of resilience back to the enterprise and providers, which is something that's called out and makes sense. So it's another way of using the sizable wallet, which is the spending capability of the federal government, to influence evolution of product evolution, and specifically the resilient requirements that should go into that product. So I think it's hard to do in practice, but I think the concept has legs, is viable.
Well, I guess it's a step in the right direction. So
I
like
think it,
everything else, if
yeah,
it's gonna go well, then it's gonna continue to develop and see the evolution of changes in cybersecurity space. I think it's a good step. So looking at the whole executive order, and you already point a couple of things on DMARC and passwordless. What other things do you think did this law go far enough, didn't go far enough, or they should have been included that we need to address, and they're more pressing than some other things that were included in this executive order?
yeah, it's a good question, Nikolai. And the one thing that comes to mind is really has to do with technology evolution. Uh, and the one problem, challenge, constraint that the federal government has is if you look at cybersecurity through the lens of the federal government, you look at millions of enterprises in the U.S. Small independent enterprises, large enterprises, but millions of different enterprises, and they all have some responsibility and accountability to, promote and implement controls for resilient practice. Um, there is a perception when you look at it across so many industry entities of a one size fits all model for cybersecurity. So if you think of it from a legislative perspective or of policies that could influence resilience, uh, you tend to have this orientation that if every one of those million enterprises just did these basic things, the world would be a safer place. The threat modelers or the threat actors would have more friction, and that would be better for the consumer. Um, and I think that's the only way practically to think through cybersecurity policy. So I'm not suggesting it's a bad thing. What I am suggesting though is at the enterprise level, and certainly our audience would appreciate this. It turns out that there's no one size fits all model for cybersecurity, and the reason for that is that the attack surface of the enterprise is different from one enterprise to another. The second part of that is the attack surface changes, it evolves, it changes, and so the use of advanced technology, emerging technology, and its indoctrination into an enterprise extends the attack surface. So if you think about ChatGPT as the manifestation of really marvelous, fascinating technology evolution, and lots of opportunities in terms of use cases, um, there has to be a little bit more onus of responsibility and accountability on the introduction of that technology into the market, with some emphasis and focus on resilience, because functionality leads and controls lag, and technology evolution has been that way, for as long as there's been technology, and I think it's time for the industry to recognize that rushing new capability into the marketplace in order to test it and refine it, and over a period of years remove defects, uh, is maybe irresponsible, even as as clearly the technology capability is game changing, innovative, different, and in some cases having tremendous upside potential in terms of the use cases. But I think what's happening is that the responsibility for resilience of the capability is not part of the design process uh, in meeting features and functions that are clearly above what the marketplace has to offer today. And unfortunately, the commercial interests are pushing that technology into the consumer space. Artificial, I don't know if artificially is the right way to describe it, but it's being pushed there. And frankly, it's not necessarily in everyone's best interest, simply because these technologies can be counted on for absolute truth and information, yet they don't have that capability yet because it's not mature enough. So how we use that technology should be part of the calculus in the introduction of that technology into the marketplace, with a little bit more emphasis on making it more resilient so that the end user doesn't carry the burden of the risk that's being introduced.
Got it. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jim, for that. And one last question that I have regarding this executive order and state of cybersecurity in general. So, will it make cybersecurity space globally better, or will only affect, let's say, United States, and we're not going to see a whole lot of improvements?
So, yeah, it's an interesting question in this regard. I would argue, Nikolai, that if we only made cybersecurity more effective for infrastructure in the United States, in reality, that would improve cybersecurity resilience across the globe. So I don't, like, even if we wanted to say we're only going to do this for citizens of the US, in most cases, the advancement in resiliency practice will be unequivocally implemented across borders as it should. So the hard infrastructure, like the investment in chip manufacturing, that's pretty much isolated to the United States. But even that in of itself, if you look historically in the semiconductor industry, a lot of the standards and evolution of specific chips for specific products emerged with some standards around them and how they're used in the United States, or originated in the United States, but are used, globally. I think of some of the operating system, standards that are well established across the globe as being, an example of that. So in some respects, even if we wanted to make something totally exclusive, US-wide only, I don't think we could. I just don't think that's the way technology evolves and is distributed. So we're going to influence the global footprint, and hopefully that will, continue over time.
Yeah, thank you for that. So yes, definitely the US has a major effect on whatever is going on globally. So I think you're right. By way of improving whatever we do here, it will help everywhere else. All right, I think we're coming to the end of our today's segment. And once again, Jim, thank you very much for joining, participating. And if you have any parent thought that you'd like to share with the audience, I'm gonna turn it over to you and to say a few words.
Yeah, I think cautious optimism is the way I'd summarize my thoughts in terms of cybersecurity policy today. I've been frustrated with the cybersecurity policy in the past as being lacking, not comprehensive, and in some cases just not even practical. And I don't, and I think we've made steps in maturity of cybersecurity policy overall as a country, and so that makes me cautiously optimistic going forward.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you, Jim, once again for having me, for coming on the show and having you here. So definitely your thoughts are appreciated, and I'm sure our audience will reflect on that as well. And to everyone who is watching us and listening, thank you for participating. And remember, we're stronger together. So together, all boats rise with the tide. So thank you very much, and stay tuned for next episode.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about these topics or IS Squared, please go to www.issquaredinc.com.